Hello, everybody. My name is Viviana Mazza. I'm a journalist at Corriere della Sera, and I'm happy to moderate this panel today organized by ISPI. And the title is Feeling Tunisia's Democratic Pulse, Hopes and Challenges Ahead. After 10 years after the revolution, Tunisia is facing both institutional and socio-economic challenges. We have today a panel discussion with four guests, four speakers, and we will try and address the political problems, the institutional deadlock that is happening in Tunisia, the economic issues that the pandemic certainly didn't help, and also the protests and the police brutality that have also increased the tensions from a different generation, from the generation that experienced the revolution. And so I'm also interested in exploring with the panel today what Europe can do, what role should Europe play, and how to reverse the negative trends to find the hopes from the title ahead in Tunisia's future. I'm happy to introduce the panel. Youssef Cherif is director of the Columbia Global Center in Tunis. Intissar Kherigi is co-founder of the Jasmine Foundation. Teevan is a policy officer at the European External Affairs at the European Center for Development Policy Management. And Dr. Sarah Yerkes is a senior fellow of the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I will start by asking Mr. Cherif to talk about the political situation. We have a stalemate between the president and the prime minister, and absent a constitutional court to determine, which party is abiding by the constitution. The clash continues. What are, the prospects for this situation, and what are its consequences on Tunisia? You have the floor.
Thank you. Well, actually, the current stalemate didn't start yesterday. Tunisia is in a period of instability since the fall of dictatorship in 2011. And whatever observers, politicians, diplomats say, the country is actually still in transition. But it's true that the problems exacerbated in the last 2 years following the sudden death of President Mechichi in summer 2019, the surprising results of the autumn 2019 elections, and then the COVID outbreak. And that actually pushed Tunisia to the current situation, which is perhaps the most complicated one in the last decade of democracy. Now, what we are facing is a crisis in the system of governance, because the kind of political system that was established following the fall of dictatorship was actually a political system that replaced the one party, one ruler system. And from that model that used to turn around one person, the country is now led by some sort of triumvirate that, again, was established more or less in 2011 and was confirmed by the Constitution of 2014, where you have a president, a parliament speaker, and a prime minister, in theory called the three presidents, who are ruling the country together in harmony. But again, the elections of 2019 brought to power different power structures, about different power circles that do not necessarily agree with each other. And as you rightly pointed to, there is no constitutional court to solve the issues among them. Of course, one of the main solutions, or maybe the easiest solution today, is to agree on a constitutional court, solve the problems and clarify the prerogatives so that every one of them works separately and does his or her job as according to the constitution. Now, the problem with the Constitutional Court, and the reason why there is, and one of the reasons why there is no Constitutional Court today, is that previously, when Ennahda was actually the strongest player in the country, say in the last 5 years, Ennahda was not very proactive in establishing the Constitutional Court. But now we see that Ennahda, which is still the strongest political party in the country, we see Ennahda advocating for putting in place the Constitutional Court. But whether it's doing that to defend democracy or because the president is becoming too powerful and the president is threatening its legitimacy or its popularity, there is a question mark there. So when Ennahda today is defending the establishment of a constitutional court, we see a lot of resistance from the other side. So here, this is the first dilemma, and it's too bad that the constitutional court was not established maybe 5 years ago, when there was a little bit more consensus around it in the country. This doesn't mean that there's no solution, and you would notice that in the last 10 years and even now, the crisis in Tunisia is not being solved by weapons or by tanks or by coup d'etat, but rather by incendiary statements, but they remain statements. The issue is still at the level of rhetoric, of speeches, sometimes popular movements or street movements, but that are actually controlled, contained, limited, and therefore nothing is lost. And there is no constitutional court, but there are some attempts by civil society organizations, notably the labor union, the union of business leaders, the same groups that pushed for the national dialogue in 2013, 2014. We see them again today, and they are still quite powerful, and they are pushing for discussion. And now that we're talking, actually, the president and the parliament speaker had a meeting just a few minutes ago, 1 hour ago, and that's already hopefully the beginning of some stability or of less tension in the country, hopefully. So this is one thing about the Constitutional Court, and ideally, once they go back to some calm among them, to less tension, ideally they could establish a constitutional court so that instead of having informal mediations, we have clear and institutionalized ones. Now, another issue that should be solved and that needs to be solved now is this issue of who has more legitimacy and who has more power. And this is not only about the Constitutional Court, especially with regards to legitimacy, but with regards to the popular mandate. Because it's true that the president was elected by a large majority, but he was elected without having a clear vision, without having a clear program. And we see the results of that today. He doesn't have a machine around him, and he got elected because he seemed perhaps less corrupt or more idealistic and more reformist than others around him. But that's not enough to rule a country. So perhaps the electoral law needs to be changed. The conditions to run for election need to be changed so that when a president runs, he needs to have a team around him, a program, etc., or her, etc., etc. And the other thing, again related to legitimacy, those who were elected in 2019, many of the political parties and groups that got elected in 2019 lost a lot of popularity. Actually, some political parties fragmented since then. So those who are in parliament today, many of them do not represent the ideas and the groups that they presented themselves with in 2019. So they are not anymore representative their electorate. So here, what I'm trying to say here is that the configuration changed entirely. And so if there is, if the tension continues between the different political players, if the situation does not improve, then there needs to be early election in the country, which is, again, not the end of the world. Things are still very peaceful in Tunisia, and I think will continue to be peaceful. So early election may be an opportunity to move out of the current problem, but with the condition that some points of the electoral law needs to be changed about who can run for election, about the threshold to enter parliament, so that not just very divided and small groups become masters of the parliament without having strong representation on the ground. But then again, early elections may be a solution. Of course, the country is facing a dire economic and a sanitary situation, so this will make early election quite complicated. But I don't see another democratic way out of the crisis if it's not solved in the upcoming days through the mediation that I talked about.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask Ms. Intissar Kherigi about another aspect of this crisis. I mean, there's also economic problems with people that during the COVID pandemic have lost their jobs, and the unemployment rate rose. And we've seen, in Tunisia, I think that there is people that used to protests in January, but we didn't have just protests in January. We had, different waves. So I would like, with your help, to look at the economic situation, the disparities that there are in a society, and also, this wave of protests and how they've been managed by the institutions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Viviana. Yes, I think that the situation has certainly been deteriorating since 2019, very clearly. Of course, since 2011, there have been difficulties with the economy because in a transitional context, there has been a lack of governmental stability, which of course affects investment and affects economic reforms. But also, let's not forget that Tunisia is in a region that is also in motion and going through a lot of changes. So the situation in Libya had a huge effect on the economy, since Libya was a very big destination for Tunisian workers. So after the revolution, 2011, around 100,000 Tunisians came back from Libya due to the conflict. And that has been ongoing, of course, until very recently with the breakthroughs in the peace process. And so there has been, it's been a difficult economic situation in Tunisia since 2011. We saw some improvements towards 2019. 2019 was a very positive year in terms of positive GDP growth, the fall of inflation, some signs of an economic recovery. But unfortunately, what we've seen since 2019 is a sort of double hit of a pandemic, which has really affected major sectors like tourism, which provide a large number of jobs, but also the political deadlock that Youssef was talking about, which has really aggravated the situation and has made it very difficult to have a stable government that has some kind of visibility towards the future, and which is able to actually address the economic situation. And so we have a situation now where foreign debt has reached around 100% of GDP. Unemployment has risen, especially among young people. And of course, this is the biggest issue for citizens. They're not really concerned with the political wrangling that's happening. They're not really concerned. People are interested in the constitutional situation, but in the end, people want results. And really what we've seen is economic reform has been particularly tricky. And we see this, historically, when you have periods of democratization, it's particularly tricky to have democratization and the reform of institutions and the building of new democratic institutions in parallel at the same time with fundamental economic reforms. And I think what we saw, especially after the national dialogue and the political crisis of 2013 to 14, we saw that there was really a focus on democratic reforms and democratic institution building, and fundamental economic reforms have taken a backseat, unfortunately. And that's partly, the focus on finding, building the democratic institutions, which depend on finding a consensus between elites. Because at the end of the day, democracy also needs an agreement among elites that they will abide by the rules of the game. And so this kind of, elite pact that was developed during 2014 has at the same time made it much harder to have fundamental economic reforms and to address long-standing issues. I mean, Tunisia's economic challenges did not start in 2011. Let's be clear, there were uprisings, there were protests before that, in Gafsa, in Ben Girdain, and other places. There, are significant territorial inequalities between different regions, which played a very big role in the revolution. So we see, for example, that 92% of industry is based on the coastal areas. We have 85% of the country's GDP being produced in just 3 cities, in Tunis, Sousse, and Sfax. And so there are significant imbalances already in the economy, which really need to be addressed through a comprehensive strategy. And this comes back to what Youssef was saying about political instability, is that long-term and fundamental economic reforms require strong governments that have some kind of strong mandate and visibility. And so it's very difficult to undertake the kind of difficult reforms that in the short term are going to have some painful impacts, especially on the most vulnerable groups. This is going to undermine potentially political stability at a time when democracy and stability are already very fragile. But also, I think we should zoom out and sort of look at also other transitional countries and benchmark. And if we look at the experiences of other transitional countries, we see that Tunisia's situation is not so unusual. Transitional periods don't tend to witness very vibrant economies, unfortunately. So, for example, the Russian economy, 10 years into its transition, was half the size that it was at the beginning of the transition. You have the same situation with many post-communist transition countries, which actually underwent very deep and quite long recessions. And so we have to recognize that many new democracies actually face serious economic problems. This doesn't reduce the responsibility on politicians to actually take the difficult decisions. And unfortunately, I think they've delayed them for far too long. But we also need to recognize that supporting democratization sometimes requires allies of newly democratic regimes to help keep them afloat while they get through this very difficult and tricky period of trying to balance, institutional reforms together with the painful reforms that actually the old regime, that authoritarian regimes put off making for many decades. So we see the example of Spain, for example, that was able to rely on strong commitment from its neighbors, from the European Union, while reinforcing its economic liberalization. So I think this is very important, but also linking it to the political, the institutional reforms. One of them is the electoral system. Coming back to the issue that Youssef was raising, is that fundamental economic reforms really require a strong and stable government. And so this requires reviewing the electoral system to really be able to produce a government that's able to undertake longer reforms and not be thinking continuously about surviving until the following week. And the current electoral rules, unfortunately, don't encourage the formation of stable governments, and they actually encourage fragmentation and splintering and make it very difficult to govern and to legislate. But also, I think it's very important for political elites to have some courage and to actually tackle the deep problems such as monopolies that exist across Tunisian industries. In every industry, we have a monopoly, which is sustained, monopolies of certain families, certain connected elites that are sustained by certain administrative procedures that really function to keep out new actors. And this really keeps the economy from growing, it keeps the economy from innovating, and it excludes a lot of new actors and new entrepreneurs. And at the same time, I think, speaking of the economy, we can't not address the informal economy, which has become a significant part of the economy, perhaps the majority, which was tolerated under Ben Ali and encouraged as a means actually of managing difficult border regions which don't have a lot of other economic investment. But now the formal economy really has grown to unprecedented proportions, representing over 50% of the economy. And this is causing massive fiscal losses for the state. And so there is a real problem in this area, and a real need to actually address the informal economy, strengthen institutions that combat corruption, and undertake serious political, public administration reform and economic reforms as well.
Thank you so much. I would like to give the floor to Dr. Sarah Yerkes. And my question is there a rise or a problem with populism in Tunisia today, and how does it compare to the populism we've seen in Europe, and what are its causes?
Sure. No, I think this is a really important question. And I think, what we've seen globally is that there's been a rise in populism. And I think that Tunisia actually sort of came to this wave of populism a little bit late. But certainly what we've seen from President Saied himself is that he's sort of a textbook populist, where he came in, he wasn't a political figure, he didn't have a political party, he barely campaigned, and he's come in with really no vision and no plan. And what has happened because of this, in part, is we've seen this really dramatic lack of public trust in government. This isn't only because of President Saied. This happened before the pandemic, before the election even started. We've seen rising levels of mistrust in government over the past decade, I would say, even since the beginning of the transition. And I think, there's a couple of different causes for this in addition to the rise of populism. But the biggest one, I think, is the most direct one, is the ineffectiveness of the government, some of what Youssef was talking about already. And, we've seen in Tunisia really just regular turnover of governments, with governments lasting less than a year. Prime Minister Fakh's government was only there for 5 months. As soon as he was replaced with Prime Minister Mechichi, there were rumors almost immediately about replacing him that, continue on. And so you have this, instability, this inability of governments to even just last, let alone accomplish anything. On top of that, you have vicious infighting. You have both the fights between the president and the prime minister, which in some cases are very petty, in some cases are very important and go to the issues that Youssef was mentioning between the separation of power. And then you also have the political parties who are literally fist fighting in the halls of parliament. And so when you look at that, it's not surprising that people wouldn't really feel that positively about their government and how it's functioning. Then you add to that the economic conditions that Intissar was mentioning. And I think, what's really important to remember is that, as she said, the economy was starting to improve before the pandemic hit. You were finally starting to see some really positive indicators. But around the world, the pandemic has really exacerbated the economic challenges and made it much worse. And unfortunately, in the case of Tunisia, this coincided with the 10th anniversary of the revolution. And so you had this horrible pandemic, and then you also had at the same time this kind of flashing neon reminder that it had been a decade since the transition started, and that socioeconomically many people are worse off than they were in 2010. As Intissar said, this is normal. This isn't abnormal for a democratic transition, but that sort of explanation doesn't really help the people, who are really suffering. And what we've seen also is that this government and the sort of changes in government have had an impact too on the ability of the government to adequately address the pandemic. They dealt with the first wave very, very well with lockdowns and kind of keeping things contained. But we're seeing today a resurgence of the pandemic in Tunisia with some of the worst numbers in Africa. And you have this vicious cycle that we've seen elsewhere as well of pandemic fatigue, of people willfully ignoring restrictions, which then leads to even more cases. And you have hospitals that are overwhelmed, and some regions where there are simply just not the capacity and no ICU beds at all to help people. And then the third part, I think the third cause of this kind of lack of public trust or this frustration is human rights challenges. And I think it's important that we acknowledge, that we've seen this really troubling rise in police brutality. What you're seeing is something that almost looks like what it looked like under Ben Ali, where you have impunity for the police, this really outsized role of the police unions that are letting police get away with carrying out these brutal attacks on protesters and activists. You have some crackdowns in the media space. And then you have this completely ineffective leadership at the national level that is just not signaling loudly or clearly that this sort of behavior is unacceptable. And so I think, the consequences of all of this, the consequences of this lack of public trust and this populism is that you have even more populism. You have this idea that parties that are longstanding or people that are experienced in politics are not going to be effective. When we saw in the 2019 elections was anyone who had any sort of experience or any sort of role in the government really did very poorly. But also you have a rise of polarization. And I think this is what's really dangerous for Tunisia is what you have today is the center is very weak and very fractured. As Youssef mentioned, a lot of the parties that were elected in 2019 have further fractured. This government came in as the most fractured in Tunisia's history and has further fractured itself. And, many parties who are in the center who represent sort of the middle ground, but aren't able to really get a following, either because they don't have a vision or because they can't appeal to the public, or sometimes they're tied up in corruption or other things. And so the result of that is that you have the two poles. You have the on the one hand, Abir Musi's PDL, who's kind of seeking a return to the Ben Ali era. And on the other hand, the Karama coalition, or like the Salafists. These two groups that really represent two ends of the ideological spectrum are taking up all of the air in parliament. And so they are fighting and then little's getting done, and the parties in the center aren't able to really form any sort of coalition. And the final aspect of this, I think the final outcome of all of this is a rise of protest. And this, again, is not new to Tunisia in 2021 by any means, but you are seeing people taking to the streets, I think, even in a more passionate way and, more than they were in the past. And what happens here is people are completely disengaging from formal political life. So rather than, forming political parties, running for office, or supporting political parties, people take to the streets as the most effective form of action. And that has real consequences for the health of the democratic transition. Without effective parties, without effective government ministries, without effective political leaders who are actually connected to the people, who the people believe in and who they trust, you're just going to continue this vicious cycle where you end up having people in power who don't have a constituency, who don't have a vision, who don't have a plan. And that's really, really dangerous, especially for where Tunisia sits today, as we've heard from the other speakers.
Yes, and I think that the Carnegie Center had an article that was actually, the title had The Wrong Generation, what I was, mentioning earlier, which was one of the hashtags used by Tunisian youth who are now protesting, and they are the children of the previous generation. They're the wrong generation because they don't know the brutality of the Ben Ali era, but they also don't fit into these traditional groups they found. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, I think. But I would like to give the floor to Chloe Teevan, because now the issue is, what is Europe's role? How is Europe, has there been a change or a shift in Europe's approach to Tunisia? Also after the pandemic, where does Europe stand? Your microphone is still off. Sorry.
Apologies. Thank you. So I think Intissar really put her finger on it when she said, when it comes to transitions, it's very important to have strong allies. And I think the European Union would like to think of itself as being a very strong ally. But the situation in which both domestically and internationally is so different now from at the time of the transitions from communism in Eastern Europe. And I do think that is somewhat impacting the level of political support that the EU really can and is giving to Tunisia. Ultimately, if you look at the political priorities in Europe, Tunisia hasn't really been high on the agenda for a very long time. There are so many crises in the region, but also domestically, we're increasingly facing issues in terms of the threats to democracy and rule of law within the European Union. And this to a certain extent also undermines Europe's ability to be a very strong advocate when it comes to democracy. And then ultimately where support has focused has really been on the economic and technical level. And And this has been, a lot of this is ultimately in the hands of those who are actually on the ground. And there you see quite a sense of frustration ultimately, because those who are working with the Tunisian government are frustrated by the lack of reform, by the lack of movement. And as Intissar pointed out, it's quite common that there is this stagnation and this lack of reform. But that is something that we really sense, that there's a sense of frustration there, and that this kind of goes hand in hand with the sense more broadly that the EU needs to change its approach to its neighbours, change its approach when it comes to kind of development cooperation in general, and to its technical assistance to other countries. And in Tunisia, I think that's really coming across in terms of course, there's a strong focus on migration, and I think there is more and more pressure being put on Tunisia to cooperate on migration in exchange for greater support from the EU. At the same time, I think we're seeing globally a trend towards the EU kind of pushing for more economic reforms so what would traditionally have been called conditionality, but where there's now an effort to move away from the language of conditionality, but really this kind of more for more, that economic reforms will come with more budget support and more more technical support. And then I think in Tunisia in particular, what we saw, and I think President Said's meeting recently with Commission President von der Leyen and Council President Charles Michel, the statement that followed that was very instructive, because it focused very, very strongly on increased engagement with youth and civil society. And I think that is something that the EU is trying to get better at, because it has been very focused on working with government and with the administration. And I think there will be this growing focus on trying to engage with youth, to work more with civil society organizations, and to engage in more kind of public diplomacy, more direct outreach, more engagement in that way. And finally, again, something which is really a trend internationally, but is that the EU is trying to move away from a kind of development cooperation or aid focus towards more investment. And Tunisia should be one of the main beneficiaries of this move, but I think it will be very important that the structures are put in place that allow that to really be facilitated. And I think there are efforts to work very much with the private sector to engage in looking at what does both the domestic and the international, the European private sector need in order to facilitate more investment and to really begin to help shift the economy in that way. But of course, you can't really take that without, you can't really increase investment without certain fundamental reforms. And that brings us back to the points that Intissar raised earlier in terms of the importance of getting the economy back on track.
Thank you so much. I will remind the people who are listening that if they want, they can ask some questions in the chat. And I will have another round of questions, but I ask you to keep the answers in 2-3 minutes, please, so that we give space later to to other questions. And I wanted to ask Youssef, Cherif, about, kind of a follow-up of what we're talking about, especially with the pandemic, the diplomacy of vaccines, vaccine diplomacy. What was the role that Europe played?
So from the EU, I don't have the exact figures, but the EU did contribute a lot in terms of aid to the budget, in terms of helping Tunisia cover some of the expenses related to the crisis that came from COVID, but also in providing vaccines and equipments and so on and so on. But Europe is not alone in that. You would notice that in Tunisia, the first country that actually offered vaccine jabs was Russia, the Sputnik vaccines. Not in big quantities, but in terms of PR, that worked. Today, we say that the first country that offered vaccines to Tunisia was Russia. China also offered number of vaccine jabs, I think, up to now close to 1 million, and in big quantities altogether. Just recently, they just sent 500,000 jabs. Also, previously, they sent these masks, the vaccine diplomacy that China was known for in 2020. So Tunisia was receptive to that. And as I said, the EU did help, but did not communicate well on that. And for a country that is that close, so speaking about Tunisia, we often hear European diplomats and policymakers saying that Tunisia is the first recipient of EU aid in the southern Mediterranean. One can say that the EU did not do that much with regards to helping Tunisia, especially when we see the situation in the country today, be it the back-end hospitals or the growing number of cases, the slow vaccination process, and of course the very bad economic situation.
Thank you. And I would like to ask Intissar, Kherigi, what is the perception that Tunisians have about the EU? And do you think that a reform of visa policy between the EU and Tunisia, for instance, could improve, could be possible, and could change things?
Well, I think that most Tunisians have grown up with the European Union and Europe being, very close, very prominent partners. Culturally speaking, most Tunisians have a family member who lives in Europe. There is a lot of migration, and movement back and forth. And also, Europe is a big destination for highly skilled Tunisians as well. We should remember. Apart from, the migration crisis, we also see a brain drain for Tunisia. Tunisia is losing out on thousands of very skilled workers, doctors, professors, engineers who go to Europe and who are also benefiting European economies. And so I think Europe is very much still the prominent partner for Tunisia, not just institutionally, but also culturally. But of course, we have seen that other countries have expanded their presence. We see, China and Turkey have become significant trade partners, whether through the formal or the informal economy. But I think that Tunisians are very aware that the international community has stood by Tunisia. But I think that far too much of that has been focused very much on very technical institutional reforms. And there hasn't been much communication, I think, at the subnational level, closer to people about, the role of the EU. In the European Union, for example, you have infrastructure projects that are supported by the EU, where you actually see, supported by the European Union, and that's had actually quite a big role, I think, in a lot of newer EU member states in making very visible, the support of the EU. And I think for the EU to have more communication about its support to Tunisia is very important, not just through diplomacy and at the highest levels, but also culturally speaking. I think the refocus that Chloe mentioned towards civil society and youth is very positive. Because I think civil society can play a very important role. But I think the support to civil society so far has been very much focused on the micro level, on micro projects. And actually what civil society needs in Tunisia is a sort of scaling up of their experiences. And so, what we have is kind of project funding to do very small interventions. And actually civil society in Tunisia has developed very innovative and successful models that can be scaled up. And so what we need is actually for international partners to connect the civil society experiences and actually help to create or sort of mainstream them into policy. I think that's very important. We see, for example, the social and solidarity economy, which became, has been enshrined in law last year, was something that was started by civil society in various regions. Civil society also playing a very important role in terms of local development, in terms of supporting decentralization, working with local authorities. And so I think there should be more of an approach of not treating the state and civil society separately, but actually trying to integrate civil society into discussions with state institutions around policies. And I think also, the European Union can have a very significant role at the regional and the local levels. And this is where you could probably see a lot more impact than maybe some of the national level programs. And coming back to what I was saying at the beginning, territorial inequalities are still a very significant issue. You have poverty rates that are 4-5 times in some regions what they are in others. And just to keep it short, the European Union has very good experience of addressing regional inequalities. For example, you have the European Fund for Regional Development, the Cohesion Fund, which has really sought to tackle regional disparities. And so I think that the European Union could refocus its approach on the subnational level, working on regional development, working to support the recruitment of skilled staff into the public administration at regional level, supporting Tunisia through its expertise in terms of managing regional funding and regional development, and supporting the establishment of a regional bank, for example, to support investment, entrepreneurship in interior regions. And this would bring it closer into contact, I think, with the public and help with the communication. But just to finish off, I think the terms of the relationship need to be radically redefined as well. I think what is on offer for Tunisia is not, I think, sort of appealing enough to help overcome the internal resistance that we see from a lot of entrenched interest groups, unfortunately. And so I think it really is the time now for the European Union to think about offering quite different mechanisms, perhaps thinking about integrating Tunisia into the economic area. This is something that others have mentioned on a sort of Norway-style arrangement, but really offering something that can help with integrating greater sort of social and economic integration, and also offering something that really gives significant benefits in exchange for the reforms that Tunisia is going to have to undertake.
I have a question, from the American point of view for Dr. Sarah Yerkes, because we've seen in Berlin, Secretary of State Blinken has talked about Libya and, especially the foreign forces and the need to remove them, but also a lot of other things, looking at the elections. Of course, the situation in Libya has impacted the situation in Tunisia. So do you think that, from an American perspective, that is, are they thinking of Tunisia too? Are they just thinking of Libya and extremism? And anyway, whatever they're thinking of, can it have an impact for Tunisia?
Sure, yeah, I do. I mean, I think Libya is a more important country to the United States, particularly because of the role that the United States played in the, bringing about the post-Arab Spring and the removal of Gaddafi and all of that. I think that the U.S. and particularly President Biden, who himself was vice president during the time that this all happened, they feel a responsibility to try to fix the mess that in part they made. But I do think that the United States is thinking about Tunisia. Now, the US is not nearly as important of a player as Europe, for sure. But I think that what we've already started to see is that this new presidential administration is a little bit more engaged with Tunisia than we saw, certainly under President Trump. And we're starting to see, at least rhetorically, there's a shift from just the kind of security-focused approach towards a more values-based approach, including, recognizing and applauding Tunisia for its progress. And I think, a couple of things that we've seen on the diplomatic front already is that the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, made a call to President Saied. That's a pretty big deal. We have tomorrow, actually, there's going to be a virtual visit of the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, to Tunisia to highlight the relationship. And you had a delegation in Washington last month for the IMF negotiations. So I think, we're already starting to see some of these changes. We've also seen the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a special pot of funding that the United States has available to countries that meet certain characteristics. Tunisia has qualified for that. They should be soon announcing that compact, which will be, several $100 million of assistance in water scarcity and infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of, we are seeing more, certainly way more than engagement than we saw under President Trump, and hopefully that will continue to increase.
Thank you. And following on this, I actually have a first question for Chloe Teevan coming from the audience. And the question comes from George Bright. And what he's saying is that you mentioned the need for economic reforms, but what sort of reforms? Can we avoid traditional IMF recipes? The microphone.
I apologize. We're in a strange situation at the moment, I think, where actually when it comes to economic policy in the global north, there is a huge shift taking place, particularly with President Biden in the US, but also with the Recovery Fund in the EU. And so we're seeing a kind of shift away from austerity policies in a quite dramatic way in Europe and the US. And yet it does seem that in terms of the kinds of economic reforms that are being put forward by the IMF, certainly they have been softened since the heyday of the Washington Consensus, but there is still quite a strong focus on ultimately on kind of structural reforms that will hurt many normal Tunisians in the case of Tunisia, but it's true in other countries also. That so I do think that there's actually a need for this international shift that we're seeing to also reach the IMF in a more important way. However, I think what would be really important in terms of from the European perspective is just to see first steps towards trying to deal with the economic situation in a meaningful way. The sense really is that nothing is moving any longer. And I think others can speak much more in depth about what is actually taking place at the moment. But the EU has for a long time, yes, has ultimately supported the kinds of reforms that the IMF has been pushing for in terms of reforming the public administration and has been giving quite a lot of technical support as well to try to facilitate more structured processes within the administrations and to try and make certain processes more efficient. There's a lot of work happening in terms of trying to help with the digitalization of public administrations, but a lot of what the EU is doing is very, very technical. And I think Youssef mentioned, it's not necessarily very well communicated in terms of there's a lot happening in terms of this kind of technical level of support, but it doesn't necessarily get people don't necessarily know what's happening or what that actually could mean in terms of how the EU is supporting Tunisia. And I think that's where, this new focus on public diplomacy could be quite important if it's done correctly, where there's much more of a focus on communicating what the EU does. And as someone who grew up in Ireland, what Intissar mentioned about the flags on the roads and on schools, on car parks, that is how you create a sense that, yes, this is a meaningful and useful actor, I guess. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of strategic communication for the EU to actually,
And we're starting to have more and more questions. I will ask one to Youssef Cherif. I know he has to leave at exactly 4 p.m. And also it is about something that you talked about. The question is from Alia Mubayat. Do you think that anticipated elections and the formation of a new government can help bring back a dynamic of reforms? And how should the international community support Tunisia through this longer transition period before actual reforms are put in place?
Hi, Alia. Yes, I think early elections, if they are done with So there needs to be a change in the electoral law and in the way elections are done, so that we don't find ourselves in the same situation where we are today. So if that change takes place, and there were a lot of discussions among Tunisian politicians, members of parliaments, parliamentary groups, and so on in the last few years about what kind of change is needed at the level of the electoral code and law, etc., so that we avoid the same situation where we are today. So if that's to happen, and then we have early elections, then we would probably have a more stable government. As Intissar mentioned, a government that is not thinking only about saving itself for the day after, but rather thinking about long term and making plans over 2 to 5 years. So once we have that, then we would definitely move towards more sustainable reforms, more institutional reforms that are there to last, and that will help improving the economic situation in the country. Now, what the international community can do, I think one very important point that the international community should, especially the democratic international community, should remember is that the fact that Tunisia is a democracy is not a given. So it's important to keep stressing that Tunisia is worth helping as a democracy, and that democracy needs to be kept and sustained. So that should be the first pillar. After that, more development aid, more partnership projects, the different scientific and educational cooperations. That these are things that build for the future and are frankly very needed. But sadly, we are facing a very dire economic and sanitary situation. So I think today, the first thing that the international community should do is actually helping Tunisia get more vaccine jabs, so that we have less people dying, and so that the economy can restart. And also, I think, pump more cash in the Tunisian central bank.
Thank you. And we have 2 economic questions that I will ask the first one to Intissar and the second to Chloe. The first one for Intissar is from Paul Arts. What would the much needed comprehensive economic strategy look like, taking into consideration the constraints of 1, the neoliberal order, which is still dominant, and 2, the not too cooperative attitude of EU countries that protect their own agricultural producers?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. Part of the problem we find ourselves in is that Tunisia is stuck in a particular developmental model that was put in place, from the 1970s, and which really, puts Tunisia in a particular position in the world economy, in which it is producing very low quality goods with very little added value. And we've had, part of one of the factors in the revolution was that the education system is actually producing very different types of skills to those that are that can be absorbed by this very low added value model of the economy. And so there is a real need to actually really think about how to develop value added sectors. And Tunisia has a lot of potential in this area. I mean, last year, Tunisia was, I think, chosen as one of the most innovative economies in terms of the amount of, innovation in digital technology that's happening. There are a lot of startups, especially, managed by young people that are coming up with new digital technologies. And so there is a lot of potential in this particular area. Also, agriculture is a huge sector that I think has been really underdeveloped in the country, where industry really attracted most of the investment. And so agriculture, there is a lot of potential also for developing organic farming, for example, which there is a huge demand for, I think, in Europe and elsewhere, and where Tunisia still actually has quite a good track record. And so there are a number of sectors where there is a lot of potential, but the problem is really putting the whole value chain together. Enabling producers to have access to finance is a very important thing. To be able to have access to markets as well, and where you have sectors where there are very small companies, to enable them to come together, to form cooperatives, to actually be able to access markets and invest in research and development and that kind of thing. And this is one of the major issues, I think, in the Tunisian economy, is that you have very, very small companies. I think about 98% of the economy are SMEs. And so, we need to encourage forms of small companies and small producers, especially in the agricultural field, coming together to be able to access markets. And, it is difficult to have this shift from an economy stuck in a very particular place in terms of, inputting into the global economy very low value added goods, but it is possible. We've seen it in other countries, in Asia, in Latin America and Africa. But it requires a comprehensive strategy, which comes back again to political stability. So these two things are really very much intertwined. And I think, Europe can help. Of course, there are areas where there's competition. Agricultural goods that Tunisia produces are often similar to those in Southern Europe. And so, there is a certain level of competition as well. But I think that there are many areas where there could be a lot of cooperation. And one area I'll mention just to end is also renewable energy. Renewable energy is something that, and I see Chloe nodding, is an area I think there's a lot of potential for cooperation, because, Tunisia is a ripe environment in terms of solar energy, for example, and others. And so there are sectors where there can be, a lot of win-win investments, I think, between Europe and Tunisia.
So Chloe was nodding about cooperation, but I'm going to ask you about competition, because the other question was about whether to what extent the EU still is protective of its own products vis-a-vis products coming from Tunisia, but also from North Africa in general.
I think certainly in agriculture, we do see that to a great extent. Although in the case of Morocco, there is a free trade agreement that actually applies to agriculture as well, which isn't the case with Tunisia to the same extent. But I do think that actually leads to a certain economic model that has been quite highly criticized in the case of Morocco, where ultimately to apply EU standards in agriculture is extremely costly. And that means that only very large farmers and sometimes European companies investing in Morocco can actually take advantage of that free trade agreement. But I think, in European supermarkets in Northern Europe, certainly now there's a huge amount of Moroccan agricultural produce. But the question for Tunisia then is is that the kind of agricultural production that Tunisia actually wants? And the Moroccan example is a good one to look at in terms of understanding what a free trade agreement in agriculture might mean for Tunisia. And I think a lot of the resistance to the idea of the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement between Tunisia and Europe has been focused on the fact that farmers feel quite worried about what the consequences would be of such a free trade agreement. So certainly agriculture is a difficult one. And at the moment, I think what is in place are quotas which don't really adapt to actually the production at different times. And the Tunisian Observatory for the Economy did a fascinating study a while ago where it looked at olive oil production and how ultimately the quotas from the EU on olive oil imported from Tunisia really didn't allow for any flexibility when it came to what the production in Tunisia actually was at any given time. When it comes to industry, I think there's actually so many opportunities right now because, again, the global economy is shifting. There is this strong focus in Europe on this concept of strategic autonomy, of moving away from value chains that are totally dependent on China, towards more reshoring of industry and maybe nearshoring of industry. And the HRVP, Youssef has pointed to the possibility of more nearshoring, much more, of European value chains being, of parts of the European value chains increasingly being situated in North African economies. And Morocco has already, to a certain extent, started to take advantage of that, but it hasn't been nearly enough. In the case of Tunisia, that kind of started at some point, but has really, really stopped in the last years. And there's been very, very little European investment. So I do think that there is an opportunity for much greater European investment in North Africa. But again, this will require that the structures are in place that allow that to happen. And that's also connected to kind of the European instruments to incentivize more investment in North Africa, which is a big focus within the European institutions at the moment.
Thank you. And we have one final question for Dr. Yarkis from Rosa Marian. We know that reforming the practices of the security sector has been an issue since 2011, but what do you think is causing this recent increase in police brutality?
Yeah, this is a really important question. I think in part, it's frankly the ineffectiveness of government, that there's less oversight over the security services than there used to be, that the police unions have traditionally been quite strong, but they've really been allowed to kind of act with impunity, in part because you have the government not paying as much attention or not that they don't care. Certainly, I do think that both Prime Minister Mechichi and President Saied certainly care about human rights and are concerned about this, but they just don't command the same ability to enforce these issues. And then also you have a more angry and frustrated population. And so the protests themselves have gotten a little more violent than they were before. And so it's kind of, again, a vicious cycle where you have protesters who are themselves acting a little bit more aggressive, but then the police responding really, in a way that's not acceptable, in a way that really violates human rights. And then again, crackdowns on media where you're not necessarily getting the same information about what's going on that people used to get. And so I think there's a lot of combination of factors that are enabling this to continue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We have, taken all our time and even a little bit more. So I just want to thank you all for participating in this. Youssef Cherif, who just left, Intissar, Kherigi, Teevan, and Sarah Yarkis, and also those who listen to us. And thank you to ISPI for organizing this panel. Thank you all.